Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's right on time. Thank you so much for so many coming. I think we've completely filled the theatre, which is fantastic and just shows the interest in the topic. My name is Trevor Budge. I'm going to give a bit of a presentation to you, and then we're going to be followed by Jacqui Sanders. I think most people know the format, that we've got about an hour and a few questions, and then there's some afternoon tea. Could we have it up a bit louder? Yeah, can we have it up a little bit louder? Perhaps I can speak a little bit louder. And the lights on for that or some of the lights. Okay. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an update about where the Victorian Goldfields World Heritage bid is at. And that website there, if you're not familiar with it, it's got a lot of information on it. I'm going to give an acknowledgement of country, but it's a little bit different to perhaps the acknowledgements that you normally hear. The Victorian Goldfields represent one of the major goldfields that happened, gold rushes that happened in the 19th century, in the second half of the 19th century. They happened right round, particularly around the Pacific Rim. So whether you're talking about New South Wales or Queensland, Otago in New Zealand, California, which is a very major gold rush, Alaska, Klondike, British Columbia, but also in places like Siberia, South America, all of those gold rushes took place on the lands of First People. In every case, First People were pushed aside, dispossessed, in many cases simply murdered. Let's call it what it was. There was genocide. People died of poison flower and died of disease. So in the Victorian Goldfields, we're dealing with a number of registered Aboriginal parties and some areas which have no registered Aboriginal parties. And so in paying respects, we pay respects to all those people. A very quick one-page update of where the Victorian Goldfields World Heritage Project is at, and happy to answer any questions that might come later. What we're doing at the moment is we're finalising what's called a serial listing approach, which is a multiple components. At this stage it looks like there might be 17 different component areas forming the World Heritage nomination. We'll go under the title of Victorian Goldfields, but what we're seeking to do is represent a very diverse range of attributes that are on the Victorian Goldfields. That will take us through to a preliminary assessment which we're expecting the Commonwealth Government to lodge with UNESCO in September this year. This is a new requirement by UNESCO, which has only been introduced in the last 12 months. What happens is you've got 12 months for them to do that assessment, and they've already got a large number of applications gone forward. We'll hear the results of that in a year's time, September 27. Hopefully, if we get a favourable response, we then move to the preparation of the final formal nomination called a dossier, which is the detail together with management plan, and we'd expect the Australian Government to be able to submit that in early 29, and that would lead to a decision by the World Heritage Committee, which only meets once a year in the middle of 2030. Seems like a long process, but this process has been going on for nearly 40 years, but it's really taken off in the last 7 or 8. And when we had a memorandum of understanding between all the councils that are supporting this, the 15 councils, they asked us how long it would take, and we said it would take 10 years. And they said, oh, surely not that long. And it looks like it might be 11. But more to the point, I've always said to people, if it was too easy to get, it wouldn't be worth very much. And so it's a bit of a trial by doing this process. And it's very complicated because most World Heritage sites are just a single building or a single area of land. As I said, we might be having 17 separate locations. So I'm going to whip through a quite detailed presentation about women and children on the Victorian Goldfields. It's largely derived from the Australian census. the Victorian census that was taken at the time during the gold rushes. I'm giving you far more information than I'm going to talk through, but I'm very happy if someone wants to receive the presentation. I've got an email address at the end, and you can email me, and I'm happy to send it to you if you're really interested in the topic in the detail. So let's move into it. Most gold rushes in most places in the world have been historically portrayed as a masculine event. And in some ways that's understandable because it was mostly men who were digging the holes and extracting the gold. But what it's meant is that the role of women and children have been completely, in some cases, written out of the story or have not been represented to the extent that they should be. The characteristic of Victoria is that by far, of all the gold rushes in the 19th century, there were far more women and children on the Victorian Goldfields than there were in any other gold rushes around the world. And that is a defining element. And I mentioned that the World Heritage listing is about attributes, and that's one of the attributes, that this is a very different representation of what was happening around the world. So where do we derive the evidence from? Well, there have been quite a number of writers who discuss this issue, but they've probably been at the background. And more recently, their work is coming to light, and particularly people like Claire Wright, who've, award-winning historian, recounting some of those stories. What we have are lots of stories, lots of diaries, lots of newspaper accounts which make references to women and children. But I've been particularly interested in the census. Now, the Victorian colonial government conducted a census in 1851 and 54, 57, 61, and then every 10 years after that. It's a little bit different to the census that you'll fill in August this year. Every 5 years we have a census in Australia. One of the most unfortunate things that happened was that in 1892, the Victorian government decided they would pulp all the individual returns. So we lost the whole lot. So if you're trying to trace your family through the census, which would have shown all your relatives recorded, what their occupations were, exactly where they lived and so on, all that's been lost. But what they did produce was very comprehensive records of the census. So if you look at any of these census documents, particularly by the time you get to 1861, they're 500 pages long of recording information, but it's a bit of a trawl to get through them. So one of the interesting things was that the 1851 census, which was conducted in March, I think, 1851, immediately precedes the gold rush. So we have this wonderful picture of what did Victoria look like before the gold rushes. And one of the surprising things about the census in those days was that collecting it was a mammoth task, largely on horseback, and trying to find people. And it does appear, from everything I can read, an extraordinary effort was put in to make sure they did find everybody, but there's no way that they, once the gold rushes started, that they were able to do that. For instance, in the 1854 census, when the gold rushes were underway, at least 10% of the people that are recorded in the gold districts, gold mining districts, were travelling. Imagine trying to get the details on people who are travelling. And then, of course, you had people who were coming from other countries who didn't speak English. You had the growth and huge influx of Chinese people. And so they're not totally accurate, but they're pretty accurate. So what we have to acknowledge, though, is that the census doesn't accurately record Aboriginals, and it does record Aboriginals, but there's no way known that it could be accurate at that stage. And at the same time, you've got to remember we've got 3 or 4 boats arriving every day in Port Phillip. Even recording who came off the boats is not totally accurate. But we do have these census results, though it is great that we have them. So what was the characteristic of the population before the gold rushes? Well, one of the extraordinary things was that the population, there were 40% of the population of Victoria, which was about 77,000 people, 40% were women at that stage. And that was because we had an assisted migration program. So we've had assisted migration for a long time. But what it meant was that the population was very young. And you can imagine why, because you don't just uproot yourself particularly from Great Britain and sail halfway around the world if you're not feeling fit and healthy and you're looking forward to an adventure. So we actually start with a population that perhaps the idea of then uprooting themselves and going onto a gold rush setting is not so unusual. So we start with that population, and I've got some figures here for you. So out of 77,000 people, 31% are females, right? And of course that includes women and female children as well. I've got a lot of tables, which I'm not going to go through the details, so I've just highlighted the really important points. So 1854, 3 years after that census, Victorian government, there's such population growth, they decided they have to have another census. But really the gold rushes had really only taken off in that late 1850s, and the people from overseas really only started to arrive in the early 1852. So you can see that there is still a surge of females in that group, and what we've got is about 65,000 people on the goldfields, of whom 14,000 are female. Now, as you'll see from some later material I'm going to give you, when you compare it with California, which is the great comparable goldfield, it's nothing like that. This is a standout feature of what happened in Victoria. And you can see the youth and of the population too from the data I've got there. So, what was happening in Ballarat? In fact, Ballarat has the highest proportion of females of the three major gold rush areas. Very hard to define geographically areas because they use things like gold diggings, they use mining districts, and of course then you have the growth of municipalities, so people are much more linked to places. So in the 1854 census, there's a limited number of locations. Often the location is really a big district. So what we'd seen is an extraordinary transformation. Clearly there were, Wadawurrung, there were Judjarung, etc., living in these locations, and all of a sudden they go from, a few people, don't know exactly how many, to thousands. It's an extraordinary transformation, and I think just getting our head around that, the population had trebled in the whole of Victoria, and suddenly these gold rush cities were arising. But we call them cities, but the vast majority of people are living in tents. And, you get a cold morning like this morning and you imagine living in a tent in that situation. But by 1852, Ballarat and Castlemaine had been surveyed and lots were being sold off. By 1854, and the same thing was happening in Bendigo. Government, of course, making money out of selling lots and surveying the land, but the foundations were there so quickly after that initial settlement. So by 1857, you can see that, and here's the comparisons with 54 and 51, you can see the population of the entire colony. There's now 146,000 females living in Victoria, and the increase is quite substantial. So any suggestion that, females came later is not correct. They were coming in very considerable numbers. And what we know is that from every recorded area where there were gold rushes, there were women and children living on those gold rushes. And the one I love to quote is, some of you I'm sure have been to Omeo. So Omeo was a very early goldfield, and in the 54 census, there are women and children at Omeo. It defies belief to understand how they might have got there from landing in Melbourne or from... And we often think that all this is about people coming from particularly Great Britain and Europe and North America and so on, but a lot of people also came from the other colonies of Australia. So people went overland from New South Wales, from South Australia. A lot of people came from Tasmania. So there were a lot of people who were reasonably familiar with perhaps the Australian landscape. So one of the interesting things is that by 1857, we've got a system worked out of what's called mining districts, and there are 6 mining districts across the colony. And you can see the number of females that are in each one. And again, Ballarat is the dominant place where females have come to. Is that because it's the closest major goldfield to Melbourne? Perhaps also we know that a lot of people landed at Geelong, which gave you perhaps a comparatively easy route to get to the goldfield. But certainly females are dominant in the Geelong situation. But have a look at the numbers there that are living in tents and or travellers. So here we have 6 years after the gold rushes, 70% of people are living in tents. Now when we say tents, in some cases they were quite elaborate structures, but a tent is a tent at the end of the day. So how can we summarise this? Overall, women are more likely to be found in the larger settlements. There's no doubt about that. But the point is, they are in every location. Every one of those separate districts, and they are broken down into diggings. There are women in every one of them, all right? And there are children in everyone. And of course, we know that, people had a lot more children in those days. Families had more children. And that but there were high death rates amongst children, and there were high death rates among women, particularly giving birth. One of the interesting things is that the census by 1857 records occupation, and it's commonly stated in all the commentary, though, that this understates how many women were actually participating in gold mining. There are anecdotal stories that the census collectors refused to write down that a woman, if she claimed she was mining for gold, they refused to write it down. But we have the evidence here that they were recorded as how many were actually undertaking mining of some sort. Place of birth is also very interesting, and what I would highlight here is that Irish women were much more likely to come with their husbands. Perhaps, a commentary about Roman Catholic religion, but also perhaps the conditions in Ireland, which were pretty tough, and they were still recovering from the potato blight. Here we have the 1857 compared with the 1861 situation, and you can see that the proportion of women that is continuing to grow. It's grown back to where it was pre-gold rush. So that surge of males that came with the gold rushes, it's by 10 years later, the proportion of women or females is back to what it was in the previous data. And again, Ballarat wins the prize for the number of females. And you see I use the old spelling of Ballarat because that's how the census describes it at the time. And you can see that, there's 1861 in Ballarat, there are 22,000 females on the field. So one of the things is what is their occupation? We've saw a little bit about mining, but the standout occupations are things like, and they have these groupings of occupations, can't get below that figure, but teachers, schoolmasters, schoolmistresses, governesses, music teachers, and inspectors of schools. I'm not sure that too many women would have been inspectors of schools, but and then we have tailors, shoemakers, dressmakers, outfitters, hatters, etc., and then domestic servants. Largely, women put their occupation down as not having an occupation or associated with home duties. So 1861, interesting year because we can now compare Victoria with the other colonies because they all conduct a census in 1861. Now, that central top box is so interesting. Nearly 90% of married men on the goldfields are living with their wives and children on the goldfields, they're not living elsewhere. And so there's a sense of normality returning to these instant cities that they're no longer masculine-dominated places. There's a large proportion of women in these locations, and it changes the social structure. So have a look at the number of schools that come from those days. Have a look at the hospitals that come from those days. Have a look at the services and facilities that you would find, largely because there's a high proportion of women. And you can see it's still a young female population that's in those. So overseas migration, how many people came? Very hard to tell because the records are hazy, not everything gets recorded. People who came overland is not recorded. But we've got a figure there of 582,000 people arriving by ship. The calculations we've done is we think that basically the Victorian gold rushes attracted 635,000 people, because that counts the overland people as well. But the population doesn't grow to that extent because quite a lot of people return, particularly to Great Britain. Probably they've either made their money and are going home, as they'd call it, or perhaps they didn't make their money and they're going home. So the standout statistic, and this is the one that really surprises me, is that top right-hand corner, how young the population still is. It's a tough life living on gold rush country and trying to eke out a living. I mentioned about California. So California is the great comparator with Victoria. So essentially between California and Victoria in the 1850s, they mined 80% of the world's gold. And that amount of gold was more gold than had been mined in the previous 3,000 years of human history. So there you have some sort of idea of the scale of it. It's immense. It's absolutely immense. So what happened was, if we compare, the California gold finds were early in 1848, but they really didn't take off until 49. You talk about 1849 as being the Californian gold rush. So it just precedes Victoria a little bit. So there was a census conducted in California in 1850, and so we can compare 1850 to 1854. They're roughly comparable. You can see the differences in the proportion of women that are there. This doesn't count Native American women. There were a lot of Native Americans in California. Many of them died in that first decade. But what it does show is that we started with that high base of females, and females will continue to be attracted to the place. I've got to say that all the Californian census data is all over the place. It's a terrible set of records to have to deal with. They lost some of the records got burnt, and there's gaps in the data and so on. But from what we can see, this is a comparative field. There are probably reasons why there are less females, and I've mentioned some of them there, but perhaps that overriding reason is the predominance of women who were in the colony at the start. You've got to remember that California had just got its independence from Mexico. It had been part of Mexico. So I think the big observation between 1854, after the gold rushes, and 1861 is that we moved to a situation where nearly every married man on the goldfields is living with his wife, if he's not a widow. And the other point, 1861, the census records 278 separate locations across Victoria where there's gold mining happening, gold rushing, gold diggings, as they describe them as. And in all but 2 of those locations, there are women and children. So this was a very widespread pattern. So what can we conclude from this? I think we have we're in danger of having a very stereotypical view of what gold mining's about. And hopefully in some of this research, which we're including in our nomination for World Heritage listing, that breaks this stereotypical view and tells the story of women and children in a much more authoritative way, because the documentation's really never been done before. So if you want more information and you want that set of statistics, by all means, send me an email. I'm happy to send you that presentation. But you'll also see a lot of information on the website. So with that, I'm now going to introduce our second speaker. And I think... Okay. Thank you. So, great pleasure to introduce Jacqui Sanders. Jacqui, I'm reading from a script here. I met Jacqui about an hour ago. Jacqui is the author of Form of Insanity 2025, which a publication which explores the stories of mothers and children who lived at the Ararat Lunatic Asylum. And I've got to say, in every one of those census that I recorded, people are recorded as being in lunatic asylums, and people are recorded with statements about what they were like, which you would not be able to use in contemporary society. Seriously, it's a bit of an eye-opener. So Jacqui explores that stories of the mothers and children who lived at the Ararat Lunatic Asylum between 1867 and 1907. Jacqui holds postgraduate degree in museum studies and a Masters of Cultural Heritage degree. She works extensively with archival sources, including patient admission records and newspapers to create digital and print content. Jacqui volunteers with Friends of J Ward and Arradale Asylum, Langimogala Museum and the Ararat Historical Society. And if she hasn't got enough time in heritage, she says that when she's not pursuing research, she enjoys visiting heritage sites and historic landscapes. So would you welcome Jacqui?
Okay, thank you. Oh, wow, a full auditorium. Thank you for being here today and for joining me at the Eureka Centre as part of the Ballarat Heritage Festival. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians who Trevor gave a very detailed acknowledgement to earlier today. I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians and recognise their continuing connection to the land and waterways, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I also extend this to all First Nations people, Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islander people. Today I want to talk about hidden histories. In particular, the hidden histories of mothers and children who lived inside one of Victoria's most important, yes, yet least understood, institutions, and that being the Ararat Lunatic Asylum. Now, before I begin today, I'd like us to consider this place, and I'd like to mention that this comes with a content disclaimer. This presentation will include themes regarding mental illness and institutional abuse, and this may be triggering for some of you today. So if you're feeling really overwhelmed, please do what you need to do to take care of yourself. So when we think of 19th century asylums, we often imagine isolation, confinement and illness. Has anyone actually been to Arradale? You know how isolated it is out there? Yeah? When you stand on that hill, you look out, there's just nothing. There's just hills, mountains, paddocks. It's an extremely isolated spot, even today. What we think about far less often are the mothers, the children, pregnancy, birth and family life. Yet these things existed within asylum walls and they were far more common than most people realise. Between 1867 and 1907, hundreds of women passed through the Ararat Lunatic Asylum during their childbearing years. Some arrived pregnant, some gave birth while they were admitted. All of them were separated from their children entirely, and sometimes permanently. These women and children appear in the records briefly. Their lives are reduced to medical labels, administration, dates, and discharge notes. What's missing from all of these notes is their voices, their relationships, and their everyday realities under institutional control. My research and my book, Form of Insanity, began with a very simple question. What happens when we look beyond all of these diagnoses of these maids and these miners and start paying attention to the hidden histories of the Goldfield families? Today I'm going to expand on my book, Form of Insanity, and look at different family dynamics within the mental institution. Okay. Before I begin, I'd like you to all to imagine taking a walk through the old section of Ballarat Cemetery. Amongst the vast isolation, again, very isolated spot, and the elaborate headstones, there's a small mound of dirt. A number marks the otherwise indistinguishable plot. We walk past another headstone, not a famous one, a name engraved into marble more than a century ago, now hidden under decades of moss, dirt, and lichen, which is this gravesite here. Underneath it is a standalone number which also marks the plot. But really, that's all. There's no description of who these people are, no record of what happened next, no acknowledgement of the lives that unfolded inside an institution never designed for them. And today we're under the banner of Hidden Histories in Ballarat, a city rightly celebrated for the voices raised and rights demanded, but not all histories announce themselves so loudly. To understand what life was like for mothers and children inside the asylum, we need to slow down and we need to look closely at individual cases, perhaps through the lens of death and through the lens of a cemetery. These records are often fragmentary, but when read carefully, they reveal patterns of care, control, and survival. So I'm just going to give a very brief outline to what Trevor was talking about in terms of women on the Goldfields. So we had a changing face on the Goldfields. Just briefly on the, the 1854 Ballarat census, 12,660 men compared to 4,023 women. Only 5% of these women were single. By the 1860s, the gender balance had begun to stabilise compared to the early rush years. Across the Victorian Goldfields, including Ballarat and Bendigo, women made up 30 to 40% of the population. Men still outnumbered women, but far less dramatically than the 1850s. And by 1867, so this is the year that the Ararat Lunatic Asylum opened, the population was becoming more settled and family-based. There was increasing numbers of married women, so the majority of women were now married on the fields. And of course, there was babies being born everywhere. Fewer transient minors, more permanent communities. Family households were becoming the norm rather than the exception. And we did talk about the women's roles, so they were expanding as well into boarding houses, laundresses, seamstresses, shopkeepers, and even women who were indirectly supporting the mining operations. Health and living conditions. Despite having more stable communities, sanitation was still poor, disease remained common, infant and maternal mortality rates were still high, though improved slightly from the early 1850s. In 1867, the Goldfields was no longer just rough mining camps. They'd evolved into structured towns with families, institutions and social systems. What began as a rush of men became a society of families. We can see a beautiful picture there by John Henderson. A mental asylum. So these photographs, thankfully, because I volunteer at the Historical Society, all of these photographs are very, very early. You can see a lot of the ha-ha walls, the fencing isn't up yet, and these are from the Historical Society in Ararat. If you'd like to go and have a look at those, please do. So the Ararat Lunatic Asylum opened in 1867 at the height of Victoria's driven expansion, gold-driven expansion. It was designed to house those considered mentally ill from across Victoria including the mining settlements, pastoral properties, and growing regional towns. By the 19th century, Ararat had become one of the largest asylums in the colony. And it was a big house, 65 buildings, perched on hundreds of acres of land. And it was completely purpose-built. It functioned not only as a medical institution, but as a repository for social problems that the colonial society struggled to manage. It absorbed people who did not fit easily into colonial life, and these included the poor, the exhausted, the traumatised, and the isolated. So let's have a look at some of these diagnoses. I'm not sure if you can read this, but this is the notes from a single mum who gave birth to an 8.5-pound baby girl. Of course, the child was taken away from her as soon as she gave birth, and the police have now conveyed the baby to the Royal Park Institution for children born to single mothers at that time. Okay, so for mothers, the stakes were particularly high. A woman's perceived mental instability raised immediate concerns about her moral fitness, her ability to parent, her place within the family. Admission to an asylum could mean temporary separation from children or permanent loss of custody, which is what has happened in this case. Children entered the asylum system in several ways. Some were born inside the institution and removed shortly after birth and sent to relatives, orphanages or foster care. And in Ballarat, we have the Ballarat Orphanage, which was also a place where some of these babies were sent to as well. The records rarely explain how these decisions were made. Instead, they reflect administrative convenience, moral judgment, and the limits of institutional capacity. What we see is a system attempting to impose order on lives already shaped by hardship. Importantly, these women are not marginal figures. They were miners' wives, domestic servants, farm workers, widows and daughters. Their experiences tell us a great deal about everyday life in the Victorian Goldfields and about colonial society, understanding of motherhood, mental health and responsibility. So if you've read my book, I give quite a long list of the female maladies that could land you in the asylum, but today I'll just shorten it. So women were admitted for things such as puerperal insanity, and you would find that would be if you were pregnant or giving birth or, just before birth, you'd be in there for that. Hysteria associated with that, melancholia, lactational insanity, so breastfeeding could send you mad, and nymphomania, also considered another thing to land you in the asylum. But these terms often conceal lived realities such as repeated childbirth, infant death, and that could occur for many reasons, and also the isolation. Sorry, I've got a microphone that wants to escape here. For many, the lunatic asylum was not entered into because they were dangerous, people were dangerous, they were entered into because mothers particularly could no longer cope. The colonial society had no other place to put them. However, not all mothers and children that lived within these walls fit into that category. These women and children had held very different roles within the asylum. These were the wives and the children of the medical officers and the superintendents. So let's talk about some of them today. In the 1800s, these wives often played significant yet unofficial roles in the day-to-day functioning of the institutions. Their duties were typically unpaid, socially expected, and varied depending on the size, funding and philosophy of the asylum. They were seen as moral exemplars who could bring a civilising influence to the institution. Their influence was a blend of moral authority, domestic management, gendered caregiving, and all shaped under the rules and ideals of Victorian womanhood. They often oversaw the cleanliness and domestic order of the female wards. Now keep in mind, Arrowdale had 65 buildings, 365 rooms. They organised sewing, reading and religious instruction. They helped maintain the home-like atmosphere. They acted as assistant matrons, helping female staff. They acted as intermediate authority figures between the superintendents and female patients, since notions of propriety limited male doctors' contact with women. They were crisis mediators, de-escalating conflicts between attendants and patients. They hosted visitors, donors and inspectors, presenting the asylum as a respectable institution. They provided social and emotional stability for both patients and staff, acting as a maternal figure within the asylum's paternalistic hierarchy. They organised the worship services, Bible studies and hymn singing, which was believed to calm and morally uplift the patients. They also organised fundraising efforts for small comforts for patients, such as clothing, books and flowers. While not formally acknowledged, their labour often contributed to the asylum's success and their husbands' reputations. In providing social and emotional stability, and as a maternal figure within the asylum's paternalistic hierarchy, it's hard to imagine these authoritative caregivers and moral guardians could endure the same female maladies as the patients that they managed. But they did, so let's have a look at two of them now. First of all, I'd like to talk about Olympia Prim McCreary. It's April 1868, and the place is Westbury, Tasmania. Church bells ring out to celebrate the union of these two newlyweds. Dr. James Vernon McCreary was 28 years old when he married Olympia Prim on the 23rd of April 1868. Olympia's father was a Royal College of Surgeons practitioner, so she was no stranger to the world of medicine. Olympia was also 19 years old. According to birth deaths and marriage records, they tell us that James and Olympia didn't waste time in beginning their family. In 1869, for the first time ever, the asylum heard the faintest cries of a baby that wasn't the child of a patient. Olympia Margaret had entered the world. This was the first baby of a staff member born into the asylum. Olympia, unfortunately though, tragedy struck 3 months later. In 1870, baby Olympia passed away. Now, Olympia's not featured in my book, and I'll talk about why later on, but she's newly arrived in my research. I found Olympia because I'm starting to write my next book about the blokes of Arrowdale. And of course, I'm talking about the superintendents, and their wives are slipping into that narrative now as well. So very early days for the research on Olympia. So basically, like I said, baby Olympia's passed away. And at this point, I'm still searching for her burial plot. And I work very closely with the cemetery trustees at Ballarat Cemetery, and they're at a bit of a loss at the moment too. So just shows that the invisible history of this miner still remains unsolved. Strikingly though, the Ballarat Cemetery Sexton's book also reveals that in January that same year, Dr. McCreary purchased a plot to bury their also stillborn child. So she's lost 2 babies. In 1872, baby James Vernon also arrives at the asylum. But in April, tragedy strikes again. James passes away at 2 months old from debility. These babies are the only records we have of Olympia giving birth and also grieving the loss of 2 children within the asylum walls. So we don't only have the cries of babies, but we have the tears of a mother. A few years later, Olympia had 2 more children, but this time, 1873, she's had Vernon in Northcote and Eva in 1876 in Heidelberg. It makes me wonder what was going on at the asylum for her to choose not to have her children there. I think at this stage, it's important to keep in mind that Olympia, she passed away 2 years later in 1878. She passed away from cancer. She was 29 years old. She left her 2 young children, both under the age of 5 at that stage. I have to end my research at this point. James, her husband, married the next year. He obviously had 2 young children to support and a career to pursue. But he did go on and have more children, and him and his new wife had a very great marriage, and he did continue with his career in the mental institutions, but that's for another book. I want to move on to Ellen Sampson now. Ellen does feature in my book, but only just briefly and only in relation to her 2 children. So Mary Helen Sampson, nee Savage, I'm going to call her Ellen because she shows up everywhere in the books and newspaper articles as Ellen. She was born in Dalesford in 1859. She was a child of the Goldfields. Henry Sampson, or Harry, her husband, was born in Leigh in 1855. He was the son of a school teacher. In 1865, Harry's father, so Harry was 10 years old, was appointed the English and elocution teacher at Scotch College in East Melbourne. The family arrived in Australia not long afterwards. Harry studied at Melbourne University and became a Bachelor of Medicine and a Bachelor of Surgery. He also met Ellen during this time. And a year prior to his graduation, he married her. She was a nursing assistant. For the first 10 years of their marriage, they were transferred to Beechworth Asylum. Most of the records show that Ellen was quite happy there. They lived in the first 2 stories of the administration block, and there is some prior research that shows that the patients were, keeping the place clean and tidy and stoking the fires. So she had what seems to appear quite a happy family life there. But 1890 struck. 10 years later, the medical superintendent, Dr. Beattie Smith, is reporting on a serious medical outbreak at Ballarat Asylum. It was a typhoid epidemic, and it began in June, and it continued through to the end of the year. 6 staff members and 5 male patients were infected, and the head attendant, Mr. Mowbray, a female warder, and 3 patients died. Alongside typhoid, there were cases of severe sore throat, like diphtheria. At the time of these outbreaks, the acting medical superintendent was Harry Sampson. He'd stepped in for a while because Dr. Beattie Smith was on leave in Europe. Also living within the asylum grounds was the Sampson family, which included at this stage 5 young children. Tragically, 2 of these children died during the outbreak as well. William Lionel, or Lione Sampson, was the first child to fall ill. He was 5 years old. He's also known as Lione, and there was extensive, if you have a look in Trove, there's extensive, family grieving records, burial records. And there's a report in the Argus, which I've put up here as well. So he died the 27th of June 1890. 7 weeks later, his young brother dies. So Edmund Augustus, or Eddie, he was aged 3 when he passed away. Over the last few weeks, I've been doing cemetery tours at Ararat, and what strikes me is knowing that both the boys are buried in the same plot. And that's what really strikes me, is that Ellen stood at the same plot 7 weeks apart, burying 2 of her youngest children. I can't imagine the grief that would have been involved in that. The official burial records list the cause of death for both the boys as croup, but the Beattie Smith described concurrent illnesses at the asylum as diphtheric in character. And can I just remind everyone to get their diphtheria shots at the moment, because we've got a bit of an outbreak happening again. So just to throw that in. At the time, distinguishing croup and diphtheria was difficult. Both affected the throat and the breathing. And if you want to go look at any closer, the cure was just awful back in the day. It involved mercury and all sorts of nasty things. So it was highly infectious and often fatal, especially in children. But the crisis extended beyond the asylum grounds. The home within the asylum where the family resided was deemed too damp and unhygienic for the family to live there. And you can see where it is, where that house was. So it looks beautiful, but it was full of all sorts of diseases and waterborne things. So in December 1890, discussions at the local borough council meeting reflected growing concern about public health and sanitisation. And from this meeting, the HES pan system, or the night soil removal pans, was introduced at the asylum. This was aimed at improving waste management. Up until that time, all waste management was taken care of on site. So it was improving waste management and designed to reduce contamination and spread diseases. And I guess for the Sampson family, these reforms came too late. In 1893, the family was transferred back to Beechworth Asylum. Ellen continued to have children. She had 11 children in total. 2 of her sons went on to serve in World War I and luckily returned to Melbourne, thankfully. And Harry, he unexpectedly died at Beechworth Asylum, age 50. But again, that's going to be a different story. To survive, let alone thrive as a superintendent or medical officer's wife, required a massive amount of psychological fortitude. They were not just passive observers. As I mentioned earlier, they were vital, yet invisible cogs in the asylum operation. Living on the grounds, it's difficult to imagine that both Olympia and Ellen weren't themselves experiencing proximate trauma. Witnessing the steady arrival of broken and deeply traumatised mothers and children into the asylum took a heavily emotional toll. For women like Olympia, and Ellen, the horror wasn't just the straitjacket or the isolation cell. It was a suffocating proximity to human misery, the rigid cage of social expectation, and the requirement to cultivate a beautiful, orderly family life right on the edge of an institutional abyss. Fundamentally, these women were first-hand witnesses to the grim realities of 19th century psychiatric care, even if they never set foot in a refractory ward. Despite their own family losses and the subsequent grief, melancholia, anxiety, and pure heartbreak, these housewives maintained a stoic and detached public face of colonial progress, suppressing any personal distress or empathy that didn't align with the clinical decorum of their husbands' professions. The lives of Olympia and Ellen highlight a lesser-known reality, that asylum staff and their families who live within institutional walls were just as vulnerable to disease and deep personal loss as those that they cared for. Additionally, Olympia and Ellen's stories are not silent because they lack importance. They're silent because they make us uncomfortable. Like the female patients admitted to the mental institution, these women were not failures of motherhood. They were failed by systems meant to support them. They ask us to sit with grief, vulnerability and care rather than heroism alone. Their stories matter because the questions embedded within them are still with us. Questions like, in this contemporary world where mental health matters, how effectively are we caring for mothers and children? And I have to refer back to Sarah Shillington's story. I'm not sure, you can Google her story. She committed suicide in Monash private facility in 2023. She had postnatal depression. So if you want to Google her story, this is the reasons why their stories matter today. I also want to show too today this book. This is the Inspector's Report Book for Arundel Asylum, 1867 to 1882. Just to show you how invisible these women were, I talk about, why their stories matter. And I also want to talk about the silence of their stories. So as historians, we're trained to value evidence. But working on form of insanity taught me that silence is also evidence. erasure of the medical officers and superintendents' wives from official pages of history is one of the most frustrating silences of the colonial narratives and archives. Fundamentally, the asylum archives, like the ones presented by the Public Records Office, even here in Ballarat, are strictly bureaucratic, medical, financial in nature. They tracked what the government paid for. Because Olympia and Ellen were unpaid partners, their names never appear in the records. And I want to show you this book as evidence of that. So pretty much to this page here, it's an inspector's book. It's pretty stale. It shows you how many people were admitted, how many people died, how many women, how many children, how many men. It also tells you what was happening on the farm, what was happening in the kitchen. It's pretty stale reading, to be fair. It does talk about Mary Coleman, though, who had a baby at the asylum in 1868. The Coleman woman. Oh, such a scandal. She fell pregnant at the asylum to another patient. It's mentioned in here. Paley, Edward Paley, who was the inspector, had to interview her. Got nothing out of her, of course, but it came down to apparently she fell pregnant to another patient while she was cleaning the superintendent's house. It's quite extensive in here if you'd like to come and have a look. I know I'm not wearing gloves, please don't shoot me at this stage. But this amount is the amount of time that Olympia was at the asylum. Yeah? There's not one mention of her in here, not one mention of her giving birth or losing her child. There's lots about Mary, but anyway, that's a different story. The page that I have open here is from the August 10th, 1878. It's the day before Olympia died. And what it tells you, I've copied off 2 of the extracts here. It's official visitors that have come to the asylum. What it basically tells you is that Olympia kept a tidy house. That's all we have. There's no mention of her illness, her children, or her death. There's no doubt that these women were pillars of strength, but to include the details of their daily life, their emotional and physical challenges, or their contributions in any official government report would have been seen as an improper breach of private domesticity. The records of these maids and minors were created by institutions of control. They tell us what colonial society feared. Mothers that could not cope and children who complicated neat categories. Their absence of voices is not accidental, it's structural. Oh, where'd my little thing go? Oh, there it is. Sorry. Sorry, I'm going backwards only. So just in conclusion for today, I know it's been heavy going, so thank you guys for hanging in there. I want to leave you with this final thought. The maids and minors of Ballarat Lunatic Asylum were never meant to be remembered, but remembering them now changes how we understand our past and our present. The people we've discussed today weren't mental asylum patients, but they are part of the Goldfields Asylum DNA. They were families and they were loved ones. Their children lived and they were held and they were fed and they were mourned. Even if the archives don't record it, their lives did matter. In this respect, the invisible maidens and minors we've discussed today remind us why these archives remain deeply relevant. Greater awareness encourages the stories of these people to be shared, acknowledging that every life, including those hidden behind institutional walls, deserves a place in our collective memory. Thank you. And I just want to tell you one thing. So when I started doing this cemetery tours, I don't know if you remember, I showed you the gravesite at the beginning that was covered in dirt, lichen and moss. It's Olympia's grave. And that's what it looks like today. So I've worked with the cemetery trustees, took a couple of hours and we cleaned off her plot. And these are her children. Just below here, so they're just here underneath. But hey, we're making hidden histories visible again, right? Yeah. So thank you everyone.